In 1987, inside Jeep dealerships across the American Midwest, an unprecedented engine option was quietly erased from the order books. The American Motors Corporation had gambled the future of the revolutionary Jeep Cherokee XJ on a European promise, importing the Renault J8S, a 2.1-liter turbodiesel built in France. It survived for less than 3 years on the American market. The proof of its failure was written in the numbers. A meager 85 horsepower and 132 pound-feet of torque, tasked with moving a four-wheel drive American SUV. The consequences fell heavily on the service network. Dealership mechanics, raised on heavy cast iron blocks and standard inch wrenches, suddenly faced metric hardware, fragile timing belts, and cracking aluminum cylinder heads. Parts had to cross the Atlantic, turning routine maintenance into a waiting game. The paradox was absolute. The fuel efficiency meant to save the American utility vehicle made it a dangerous liability on an open interstate. But the story of the Renault diesel Jeep is not just about a discontinued option. It is the story of a massive cultural divide. The block was an engineering triumph in Europe, but America was about to demand a kind of strength the French diesel was never built to deliver. Every week, we tell the stories of American engines, factories, machines, and industrial names that once taught the country what power sounded like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in Kenosha, Wisconsin in 1979. The story begins not with a technological triumph, but with an American financial crisis. In the late 1970s, the American Motors Corporation, operating out of Kenosha, Wisconsin, and Toledo, Ohio, was running out of capital and time. The 1979 oil shock had rewritten the fundamental rules of American driving. Across the country, fuel prices spiked, long lines formed at gas stations, and heavy V8-powered utility vehicles suddenly became a massive financial liability for the average household. For decades, the American four-wheel drive market had been defined by heavy cast iron and massive displacement. The original Jeep Cherokee, known as the SJ platform, was a sprawling, body-on-frame machine. It was a deeply trusted fixture on Midwestern farms, rural highways, and construction sites, beloved for its unyielding durability. But it was also a product of an era when gasoline was cheap, rarely achieving more than 10 to 12 miles per gallon. AMC knew that survival required a revolution. They envisioned a completely new kind of vehicle, a compact, lightweight sport utility vehicle that could fit easily into a suburban garage, handle a snowy commute, and sip fuel. The project was codenamed the XJ. To achieve the necessary weight reduction, AMC engineers took a massive risk. They abandoned the traditional heavy truck frame for a unibody structure, a design where the frame and the body are welded into a single integrated unit. This engineering shift promised to shave over 1,000 pounds of steel from the vehicle, creating a foundation for the modern SUV. But a lighter chassis was only half the equation. The new XJ Cherokee needed a power plant that could deliver unprecedented fuel economy without entirely surrendering the torque necessary for four-wheel drive capability. AMC, burdened by heavy debts, simply did not have the cash to design and cast a new, highly efficient engine from scratch. They needed an outside partner. In 1979, AMC signed a complex financial agreement with Renault, the French state-owned automaker. Renault injected hundreds of millions of dollars into AMC, effectively taking a controlling interest in the American company. In exchange for the capital required to bring the XJ Cherokee to life, Renault gained access to AMC's vast American dealer network. This alliance meant that when it came time to select engines for the revolutionary Cherokee, AMC had to look beyond its own foundries. When the Cherokee launched for the 1984 model year, it relied on a borrowed 2.5-liter four-cylinder and an outsourced 2.8-liter V6 from General Motors. But neither of those gasoline engines delivered the extreme, headline-making fuel economy that European automakers were beginning to achieve. To hit the highest possible mileage numbers, Renault reached into its own global supply chain, specifically to a factory in Douvrin, France. The Société Française de Mécanique was a massive automated engine plant jointly operated by Renault and Peugeot. Here they built the J8S, a 2.1-liter turbo diesel engine. A diesel engine, a machine that ignites fuel through the intense heat of high compression rather than a spark plug, was traditionally associated with heavy American freight. In an American truck stop, a diesel block meant massive displacement, low-end pulling power, and million-mile durability. But the Renault J8S was a completely different breed of machine. It was a small displacement passenger car diesel, engineered specifically for European roads where fuel was heavily taxed, distances were shorter, and efficiency was the absolute priority. The J8S utilized an overhead cam, an engine design with the camshaft located directly above the combustion chambers in the cylinder head, rather than buried deep inside a heavy iron block with push rods. To keep the overall weight down, it featured a cast aluminum cylinder head bolted to a cast iron block. To compensate for the inherently low power output of a small diesel, it was equipped with a Garrett T2 turbocharger, a device driven by exhaust gases that forces compressed air into the engine, allowing it to burn fuel more effectively and generate more power. When AMC announced the diesel option for the 1985 model year, it was framed as an engineering breakthrough. The engines were cast, machined, and assembled in France, crated up and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to the Jeep assembly plant in Toledo. There they were lowered into the engine bays of the Cherokee and the more luxurious Wagoneer. On paper, the American market had never seen a four-wheel drive utility vehicle quite like it. Surviving dealer literature from 1985 heavily promoted the European efficiency of the turbo diesel option. The Environmental Protection Agency rated the diesel Cherokee at an astonishing 27 miles per gallon in the city and near 30 miles per gallon on the highway. For an American family looking for a capable winter vehicle during an era of unpredictable energy costs, those numbers were a revelation. But paper specifications rarely reflect the physical realities of the American road. The engine produced a respectable 132 pound-feet of torque, but its horsepower rating peaked at a mere 85 horsepower. In Europe, where a 2.1-liter diesel routinely powered lightweight sedans navigating narrow city streets, 85 horsepower was entirely adequate. In America, that exact same engine was about to be tasked with pushing a 3,000-pound aerodynamically blunt SUV onto federal interstates against heavy headwinds. The arrival of the Renault diesel forced American Jeep dealers to learn a completely new mechanical language overnight. Dealership mechanics, raised on servicing AMC's heavy inline-sixes and cast-iron V8s, were suddenly handed service manuals filled with metric measurements, glow plug timing procedures, and strict instructions for servicing fragile rubber timing belts, a component entirely foreign to a mechanic used to thick steel timing chains that lasted the life of the vehicle. At parts counters in places like Colorado, Texas, and Wyoming, clerks began stocking European oil filters and waiting weeks on shipments from France for specialized Bosch injection pump components. The American service network, built entirely around domestic suppliers, local machine shops, and familiar hardware, was suddenly tethered to an overseas supply chain. For a brief moment in 1985, the gamble seemed mathematically sound. AMC had found its lightweight engine, and introducing French diesel engineering to American showrooms was about to expose a deep cultural divide. When the wooden crates from the Société Française de Mécanique arrived at the Jeep assembly plant in Toledo, Ohio, in late 1984, the machinery inside represented a total departure from American four-wheel drive tradition. The Renault J8S was a 2.1-liter, four-cylinder turbo diesel. To understand why this engine was considered a breakthrough, it is necessary to look at how it was built. For decades, the standard American utility engine was a massive block of cast iron, relying on sheer size, what engineers call displacement, to generate power. Displacement, the total volume swept by the pistons inside the cylinders. But Renault's engineers in Douvrin were not trying to build a heavy-duty tractor engine. They were trying to build a passenger car diesel that could mimic the smooth operation of a gasoline engine while burning significantly less fuel. To understand the physical stress inside this machine, one must look at its compression, the squeezing of air or fuel mixture inside the cylinder before combustion. Because a diesel engine does not use spark plugs, it relies on squeezing the intake air until it becomes superheated, then injecting fuel to create an ignition event. The Renault J8S operated with a massive 21.5 to 1 compression ratio, meaning the internal pressures were immense. To handle this, the engine featured a cast iron block, the main engine structure that holds the cylinders and major internal parts. But bolted to the top of that heavy iron base was an aluminum cylinder head. The upper part of the engine that helps seal the cylinders and contains valves or combustion passages. Aluminum was lighter and dissipated heat faster than iron, which was crucial for a small, high-revving diesel engine. However, this combination of two different metals meant that the engine expanded and contracted at different rates as it heated up and cooled down. In a European sedan driven on short commutes, this was a manageable engineering compromise. Under the hood of an American Jeep grinding through heavy mud, towing a trailer, or climbing a steep grade in the Rocky Mountains, that thermal stress would eventually become a profound vulnerability. The layout of the engine was equally foreign to the American garage. The Renault diesel featured an overhead cam, an engine design with the camshaft located above the combustion chambers. The camshaft, the shaft that controls valve opening and closing. Most American engines of the era used push rods, where a single camshaft sat deep inside the iron block, protected by a heavy steel timing chain that usually lasted the entire life of the vehicle. The French engine instead drove its overhead cam using a rubber cog belt. In an American service bay, a mechanic used to the indestructible timing gear of a Ford, inline-six, or a Chevy small block was suddenly confronted with a maintenance schedule that demanded the replacement of a fragile rubber belt every few years. If that belt snapped while a Jeep Cherokee was merging onto a highway, the pistons would smash into the open valves, instantly destroying the engine. But naturally aspirated, a 2.1-liter diesel would have been dangerously slow in a 3,000-pound SUV. To generate acceptable power, Renault equipped the J8S with a Garrett T2 turbocharger, a device driven by exhaust gases that forces more air into the engine. By cramming compressed air into the cylinders, the turbocharger allowed the small engine to burn more fuel and produce more power without increasing its physical size. This was paired with a sophisticated Bosch VE mechanical fuel injection system. Fuel injection, a system that sprays fuel into the engine more precisely than a carburetor. A carburetor, a device that mixes fuel and air before the mixture enters the engine. While American gasoline engines were just beginning to transition away from carburetors, this diesel injection system was highly pressurized, complex, and required precise metric calibration. The result was an engine that prioritized torque over peak horsepower. Torque, twisting force, often felt as the pulling strength of an engine. The Renault produced 132 pound-feet of torque at a low 2,850 RPM. In a muddy farm field or on a slow logging trail, this low-end twisting force made the Cherokee feel relentless. But on an asphalt on-ramp merging onto Interstate 80, the lack of horsepower became a terrifying reality. Despite these mechanical complexities, the breakthrough for AMC was undeniable. When the turbo diesel option was officially launched for the 1985 Jeep Cherokee and Wagoneer, it offered a capability that no domestic automaker could match. The American market was still deeply scarred by the memory of gasoline rationing. For a rural mail carrier in Montana, a forestry worker in Oregon, or a suburban commuter in New Jersey, a four-wheel drive vehicle that could achieve nearly 30 miles per gallon on the highway was nothing short of a miracle. It meant a driver could travel hundreds of miles without stopping for fuel, bypassing the volatility of the gas pump entirely. At the dealership level across the American Midwest, salespeople armed themselves with specification sheets that highlighted this incredible range. The diesel Cherokee wasn't marketed as a heavy hauler. It was marketed as the ultimate survival vehicle for the energy-conscious 1980s. When the engine option was extended to the new Jeep Comanche compact pickup truck in 1986, the pitch grew even stronger. A small diesel-powered pickup with European fuel economy seemed like the perfect tool for independent contractors, plumbers, and farmers looking for a light-duty workhorse. It promised the rugged, go-anywhere capability of the Jeep brand, completely divorced from the heavy fuel penalties usually associated with American four-wheel drive. But an engine is not only a collection of specifications. It is a machine that must survive the people who operate it and the mechanics who repair it. The Renault J8S had been engineered for the disciplined maintenance schedules of European drivers, who understood the necessity of letting a turbocharger cool down, warming up glow plugs on a cold morning, and replacing timing belts on strict intervals. It was about to be handed to American drivers who treated their Jeep Cherokees like disposable iron anvils. On paper, the diesel Cherokee seemed like the future of American utility, but paper could not predict what would happen when the warranty claims began to arrive. In the spring of 1985, when the first turbo diesel Jeep Cherokees and Wagoneers rolled onto American dealer lots, the initial reception bordered on disbelief. The American automotive press, still deeply conditioned by the fuel panics of the previous decade, tested the vehicle and found a machine that seemingly defied the laws of vehicle weight and fuel consumption. Motor Trend and four-wheeler magazines evaluated the new powertrain and reported fuel economy figures that were previously unthinkable for a highly capable four-wheel drive utility vehicle. For a brief window of time, the American Motors Corporation appeared to have solved an impossible equation. At dealerships in places like Denver, Colorado, and Boise, Idaho, salesmen leaned heavily on the window sticker. The EPA rating of nearly 30 miles per gallon on the highway was not just a number, it was a promise of financial security for the American driver. For a rural mail carrier in upstate New York, a forestry supervisor in the Pacific Northwest, or a surveyor working the oil fields of Texas, the Renault diesel meant they could navigate deep snow and rutted dirt roads without constantly worrying about the distance to the next gas station. The engine was almost exclusively paired with a 5-speed manual transmission, requiring the driver to actively manage the gears to keep the engine in its narrow power band. Power band, the specific range of engine speeds, measured in revolutions per minute, where the engine operates most efficiently and produces the most pulling force. Because the Garrett turbocharger required exhaust pressure to build boost, the engine felt incredibly sluggish off the line. But once the turbocharger engaged and the torque arrived, the lightweight Cherokee became a steady, relentless machine on a muddy trail. In 1986, AMC doubled down on the European experiment. They expanded the availability of the 2.1-liter turbo diesel to the newly launched Jeep Comanche, a compact pickup truck sharing the Cherokee's unibody platform. This moment represented the absolute peak of the Renault engine's American promise. A dealership in rural Iowa could now sell a compact truck capable of hauling a half-ton of feed or fencing supplies across a Midwestern farm field, while returning the fuel economy of a small imported commuter car. Fleet buyers began to take notice. Agricultural supply companies, rural utility fleets, and independent contractors saw the diesel Comanche and Cherokee as the ultimate economical workhorses. In an era when a standard American half-ton pickup might struggle to achieve 12 miles per gallon, the diesel Jeep offered a way to cut fuel budgets in half. The sound of the French diesel, a rapid, clattering idle completely distinct from the deep rumble of an American V8 or the steady hum of a domestic inline-six, briefly became the sound of forward-thinking American utility. The American Motors Corporation capitalized on this momentum, integrating the diesel option into their national advertising campaigns. The Wagoneer, the luxury variant of the Cherokee featuring faux wood grain siding and plush interiors, was also offered with the Renault engine. It was marketed to affluent suburban families in places like Connecticut and Illinois as a sophisticated, European-flavored alternative to the crude, heavy domestic wagons. AMC had successfully placed a highly specialized, aluminum-headed French diesel into every corner of the American market, from the muddy ruts of a farm to the pristine driveways of the American suburbs. But a machine's reputation is not built entirely in the showroom, nor is it sustained by magazine reviews. It is built in the harsh, unforgiving realities of daily work, where maintenance schedules are often ignored, loads are often exceeded, and drivers demand instant, effortless power. The Renault J8S had been designed for a continent where driving was a calculated, highly regulated act, but it was now operating in a country that treated its four-wheel drive vehicles like indestructible iron tools. At the height of its rollout in 1986, the AMC dealer network was fully committed to the European diesel narrative. Dealerships from the logging towns of the Pacific Northwest to the sprawling suburban avenues of Chicago displayed the turbo diesel Cherokee as a technological halo. The factory in Toledo, Ohio, was running at a relentless pace, dropping these lightweight, aluminum-headed French engines onto the assembly line, right alongside AMC's traditional cast-iron power plants. It was a bizarre mechanical pairing. American stamped steel bodies united with European precision engineering. For a fleeting moment, the fuel savings seemed to justify the alien hardware. American drivers, traditionally used to replacing points in a distributor, swapping heavy spark plugs, and pouring cheap bulk oil into massive V8s, were briefly willing to learn a new routine. Owners adapted to the starting procedure of a diesel engine, waiting in the freezing Midwestern cold for the glow plugs, small heating elements that warm the combustion chambers before ignition, to cycle before turning the key. They learned to let the engine idle after a long highway run so the Garrett turbocharger could cool down. This level of mechanical sympathy was highly unusual for the American off-road consumer, but the reward of bypassing the fuel pumps made it feel like a worthwhile trade. To understand the sheer scale of AMC's ambition during this window, one must look at the physical landscape the company was trying to conquer. The Jeep badge was not merely a brand, it was an unspoken guarantee of rugged independence. AMC was selling the Renault-powered Cherokee to people who expected to crawl over steep grades in the Rocky Mountains, drag small aluminum fishing boats out of muddy Wisconsin lakes, and idle for hours in sub-zero Dakota winter storms. They were attempting to replace brute displacement with high-strung, turbocharged efficiency in the most demanding automotive sector in the country. In an America where a four-wheel drive badge promised unyielding iron, relentless torque, and an engine that could be fixed in any gravel driveway between Ohio and Wyoming, power was not a European calculation. It was iron, fuel, labor, heat, sound, repair, and a deeply understood contract of survival. The Cherokee itself was an undeniable triumph, fundamentally rewriting the rules of the American SUV market. Its unibody chassis was rigid, its interior was comfortable, and its footprint was perfectly sized for the shifting American demographic. Because the vehicle itself was so revolutionary, the diesel engine underneath the hood was carried along on a wave of widespread critical acclaim and strong initial sales. Fleet managers for utility companies calculated the lower fuel costs on their ledger books, and suburban families praised the range. It appeared that AMC had successfully bridged the gap between American utility and European economy. The badge had found its believers, and the factory was delivering the machines. The promise of European efficiency had carried Jeep into a modern design era. But beneath the aluminum cylinder heads, the first mechanical cracks were already beginning to spread. The collapse of the Renault diesel Jeep did not begin with a corporate press release, a massive federal recall, or a sudden shutdown of the Toledo assembly line. The first crack was almost invisible. It arrived in the form of a black puff of soot exiting a tailpipe on a freezing morning in Minnesota. The problem was not that the engine was inherently flawed. The problem was what it was forced to drink. American diesel fuel in the mid-1980s was not European diesel fuel. In France, the Renault J8S was fed highly refined, high-cetane fuel designed specifically for lightweight passenger cars. Cetane, a measurement of how quickly and smoothly diesel fuel ignites under pressure. Higher cetane means a cleaner, more controlled burn. But at an American truck stop, a rural highway station, or an agricultural co-op, diesel fuel was formulated for massive, low-revving industrial engines, like those built by Cummins, Mack, or Caterpillar. American diesel had a lower cetane rating, a much higher sulfur content, and a distinct tendency to gel into a thick wax when the temperature dropped. When this crude, heavy American diesel was pumped into the sophisticated Bosch mechanical injection system of the Renault engine, the results were deeply corrosive. The fuel did not burn completely. Heavy soot quickly accumulated inside the combustion chambers. It fouled the glow plugs, making the small engine violently difficult to start on a cold Midwestern morning. A Jeep owner in Wisconsin who bought the vehicle specifically for its four-wheel drive winter reliability suddenly found themselves stranded in their own driveway, cranking a frozen engine that simply refused to catch. But the fuel quality was only the beginning of the mechanical reckoning. The second crack appeared when these vehicles were driven the way Americans expected to drive a Jeep. In Europe, the 2.1-liter diesel was a commuter engine, designed for consistent speeds and relatively light loads. In America, it was bolted into a Cherokee or a Comanche pickup and asked to tow aluminum fishing boats, carry heavy loads of feed, and merge onto the highway with the throttle pinned to the floorboard. This constant heavy throttle operation exposed the engine's most fatal vulnerability: extreme thermal stress. As previously noted, the Renault engine featured a cast aluminum cylinder head bolted to a cast iron block. Under the intense, sustained heat of an American highway run, pulling a 3,000-pound SUV against the wind, the engine ran incredibly hot. The aluminum head expanded at a much faster rate than the iron block beneath it. Over time, this constant, microscopic flexing warped the cylinder head. The head gasket, the crucial mechanical seal between the block and the head that keeps pressurized engine coolant and lubricating oil from mixing, would eventually fail. In the worst-case scenarios, the aluminum head itself would simply crack under the stress. A cracked cylinder head meant immediate, catastrophic engine failure, instantly turning a fuel-efficient commuter into a dead, steaming piece of metal on the side of Interstate 80. Then came the timing belt. The rubber cog belt that drove the overhead camshaft was a ticking clock. European drivers were culturally conditioned to follow strict, mileage-based maintenance schedules. American four-wheel drive owners were accustomed to heavy steel timing chains that required absolutely zero thought and routinely lasted 100,000 miles. When a Cherokee owner inevitably ignored the 60,000-mile replacement interval for the rubber belt, the material degraded and snapped. Because the Renault was an interference engine, a high-compression design where the valves open so deeply into the cylinder that they occupy the same physical space the piston uses at the top of its stroke, a broken belt meant the pistons violently smashed into the open valves. In a fraction of a second, the engine destroyed itself from the inside out. When these broken, smoking vehicles were dragged back to American Motors dealerships on flatbed trucks, the true nightmare began. The AMC service network, a cornerstone of American mechanical trust, completely fractured. A dealership mechanic in Texas or Colorado who could rebuild an AMC 4.2-liter inline-six in his sleep with standard inch wrenches was suddenly confronted with a shattered French diesel. They lacked the specialized metric tools required to safely disassemble the block or calibrate the Bosch injection pump. They lacked the diagnostic experience to tune the Garrett turbocharger. At the parts counter, clerks desperately flipped through translated service manuals, trying to locate part numbers for hardware they had never seen before. Most devastatingly, they lacked the physical parts. If a traditional American engine broke a water pump or a timing gear, a dealer could source a replacement from a local warehouse by the afternoon. But for the Renault J8S, major components had to cross the Atlantic Ocean. A Cherokee with a cracked cylinder head or a blown gasket could sit in a dealership service bay in Ohio for 4 to 6 weeks, waiting for a wooden crate to arrive from the factory in Douvrin. The engine still ran for some, but the system of trust, repair, and parts availability that kept American vehicles on the road was rapidly collapsing. The financial math of owning the diesel Jeep was beginning to invert. Whatever money a driver saved at the fuel pump was now being consumed by massive repair bills and weeks of lost time. The machine had exposed the absolute limits of the American garage. But out on the open market, a much larger, unforgiving force was preparing to finish the French diesel for good. While dealership mechanics struggled with cracked aluminum and broken timing belts, the macroeconomics of American fuel underwent a massive reversal. When the Cherokee launched, the memory of the 1979 oil crisis was still driving consumer anxiety. But by the middle of 1986, global crude oil prices crashed. The cost of standard gasoline plummeted at pumps across the United States. Suddenly, the primary argument for the Renault diesel, extreme fuel efficiency at the cost of horsepower, evaporated overnight. An American driver was no longer willing to endure terrifying highway merges and massive repair bills just to save a few dollars a week on fuel. The market had corrected itself, and in doing so, it stripped the French engine of its only true competitive advantage. But the final blow did not come from the price of oil. It came from inside AMC's own engineering department. In 1987, Jeep introduced a new optional power plant for the Cherokee and the Comanche pickup, the legendary 4.0-liter inline-six. An inline-six, an engine design where all 6 cylinders are arranged in a single straight row, naturally balanced and inherently smooth. Unlike the fragile, aluminum-headed European diesel, the new 4.0-liter was a massive block of American cast iron. It featured a sophisticated electronic fuel injection system, and most importantly, it produced 173 horsepower and 220 pound-feet of torque. The introduction of the 4.0-liter instantly turned the Renault turbo diesel into an obsolete relic. On a dealership lot in Michigan or Texas, a buyer could choose the heavy-duty iron of the inline-six, which could merge onto a highway effortlessly, tow a heavy boat without overheating, and be repaired by any mechanic with a standard wrench set in a dirt driveway. Put side by side on a specification sheet, the diesel looked like a mathematical error. Why would an American buyer pay a premium price for 85 horsepower and an overseas parts wait list when they could have 173 horsepower of domestic iron that would run forever? Dealerships across the country quietly stopped checking the box for the Renault J8S on their factory order forms. The remaining diesel vehicles simply sat on the lots, unwanted and increasingly misunderstood by a public that was rapidly returning to large displacement gasoline power. Then came the corporate execution. By early 1987, Renault was facing severe financial turmoil in Europe and a shifting corporate strategy. Seeking an exit from the American automotive sector, they agreed to sell their controlling interest in the American Motors Corporation to Chrysler. Chrysler, led by the famously ruthless executive Lee Iacocca, was not buying AMC to acquire its complicated European supply chains or its legacy passenger cars. They were buying AMC strictly to get their hands on the incredibly profitable Jeep brand, the brilliant unibody design of the Cherokee, and the newly modernized factory in Toledo. When Chrysler executives took control of the Jeep division, they immediately began purging the lineup of its outsourced problematic components. They had their own engine divisions, and they now owned the brilliant 4.0-liter inline-six. There was absolutely no place in Chrysler's corporate architecture for an underpowered, warranty-plagued French diesel that required specialized metric training. The corporate consolidation was swift and entirely unsentimental. The contract with the Société Française de Mécanique in Douvrin was severed. By the end of the 1987 model year, the turbo diesel option was quietly erased from the Jeep catalog. There was no grand announcement, no final commemorative edition, and no mourning from the American Service Network. Dealerships were simply relieved they would no longer have to explain to angry rural customers why an imported cylinder head was back-ordered for 2 months. The grand experiment of European efficiency had collided with the brutal realities of American highway speed, heavy loads, and repair culture. The Jeep Cherokee itself went on to become one of the most successful and beloved utility vehicles in American automotive history, selling millions of units over the next decade and fundamentally inventing the modern SUV craze. But it did so powered by heavy domestic iron and cheap American gasoline. The engine still ran. The gas prices dropped. The new iron arrived. The factory canceled the orders. The crates stopped coming. The metric manuals gathered dust. The timing belts snapped. The cylinder heads cracked. The parts dried up. The badge meant nothing. The world it powered was gone. The French diesel was quietly wheeled out of American assembly plants, leaving behind a brief, forgotten chapter cast in aluminum and iron that would soon scatter across the scrapyards of the Midwest. When Chrysler took control of the Jeep brand in 1987, they did not just cancel the Renault turbo diesel option, they actively buried its memory under a tidal wave of domestic iron. The Jeep Cherokee XJ went on to become one of the most defining vehicles in American automotive history, remaining in production until 2001. It sold nearly 3 million units, largely powered by the indestructible AMC 4.0-liter inline-six. Renault, bruised by financial losses and unable to secure a permanent foothold in the American passenger market, completely retreated across the Atlantic. The Société Française de Mécanique factory in Douvrin continued to operate for decades. It churned out millions of J8S diesel engines, which went on to power Renault sedans, European delivery vans, and French taxicabs with legendary reliability. In the context of the European continent, the engine was a massive, undeniable success. But in the context of American engine history, it became a ghost. Because the Jeep Cherokee chassis was so incredibly durable, The vehicles themselves rarely went to the junkyard when the French engines failed. Instead, they became the subjects of massive, desperate engine swaps in garages and machine shops across the country. When an aluminum cylinder head cracked or a timing belt snapped on a diesel Cherokee in the early 1990s, an American mechanic would simply drag the vehicle into a service bay, unbolt the Renault engine, and hoist it out. In its place, they dropped in salvage yard Chevy, small block V8s, Buick V6, or AMC inline-sixes. The sophisticated, lightweight European diesels were tossed into the scrap metal bins of Midwestern salvage yards, melted down and entirely forgotten. Today, finding a factory original, running 1985 or 1986 Jeep Cherokee or Comanche with a Renault 2.1-liter turbo diesel is nearly impossible. They are among the rarest four-wheel drive vehicles in America, but a deeply dedicated preservation community still hunts for them. On vintage Jeep restoration forums and at specialized engine shows, these surviving vehicles are treated with a strange, fascinated reverence. The collectors who keep these machines alive face an incredibly hostile repair landscape. To rebuild a Renault J8S today, an American enthusiast must scour European online auction sites for new old stock components, factory parts that were manufactured decades ago but never sold. They trade translated French service manuals, swap part numbers for Bosch injection pumps, and hoard fragile rubber timing belts like precious artifacts. But this preservation effort passes the ultimate test. This is not mere nostalgia. An intact running Renault diesel Jeep is not preserved because it is the best engine America ever saw. It is preserved because it is a physical, undeniable argument about the limits of engineering. It proves that an engine is never just a collection of metal, compression, and horsepower. An engine is an ecosystem. You cannot transplant a highly efficient European commuter heart into a heavy American workhorse without also transplanting the European speed limits, the high cetane fuel, the metric toolboxes, and the culture of strict preventative maintenance. There is a striking footnote to this history. Decades after the Renault experiment failed, the corporate entity that eventually absorbed Chrysler, now a global conglomerate known as Stellantis, would try the exact same maneuver. In the 2010s, Jeep introduced the EcoDiesel, an Italian-designed turbo diesel engine, into its modern American lineup. And just like the Renault J8S, it initially promised incredible fuel economy, only to be crushed by the brutal realities of American emissions regulations, complex overseas parts supplies, and the unforgiving nature of the American highway. The badge changed, but the cultural clash remained exactly the same. America has always demanded a very specific kind of power. It demands machines that can survive neglect, absorb terrible fuel, cross vast federal interstates at high speeds, and be repaired with standard tools on a dirt driveway on a Sunday afternoon. When an engine company forgets that reality, the market corrects the mistake with ruthless speed. Somewhere in rural Ohio, sitting in the shadows of a drafty machine shed, an early Jeep Cherokee Wagoner sits with its hood propped open. Beneath a layer of heavy barn dust, the aluminum cylinder head of a Renault J8S turbo diesel still rests on its iron block. The metric bolts are untouched. The rubber timing belt is dry-rotted and stiff, and a faded French warning label clings to the fan shroud. A silent, frozen monument to a time when America tried to learn a new mechanical language and quickly decided it preferred the sound of iron. See you in the next one.